This is an ABC News special report. The Mueller Report. Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Good afternoon. We're coming on the air right now because the Attorney General William Barr has delivered the principal conclusions of Special Counsel Robert Mueller on the Russia investigation to Congress, to the chairman and ranking members of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, a 4-page letter outlining the special counsel's report, what has been found, what the conclusions are. I want to start out going to our Chief Justice Correspondent, Pierre Thomas, for more on this. We have the letter right now, and it's divided into a couple of different sections. Pierre, first of all, describing the work the special counsel put into it, the amount of people he had on the case, the subpoenas he issued, and then going on to describe and summarize Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Take it from there.
Well, he describes the extensive actions by the Russians to interfere in the presidential election. It talks about the hacking of the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign, as well as the hacking of John Podesta. It also talks about the social media campaign aimed at sowing divisions among Americans along the issues of immigration, race, and other ways. So he basically makes it very clear that this was not a hoax in any regard into what the Russians did, that this was an active and very pervasive campaign they conducted.
He then goes on to say that the special counsel did not find, and this is significant, did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated the Russian government in these efforts, despite multiple offers from Russian-affiliated individuals to assist the Trump campaign. Dan Abrams, this is key.
Yeah, that's the critical question with regard to interference in the election and conspiracy with the Russians. It sounds like the special counsel did not find that the Trump campaign, as you just said, conspired with, coordinated with the Russian government efforts, despite those offers from the Russians to assist. So it's basically question 1 is Russian interference. Question 2 is obstruction of justice.
More complicated conclusion there on obstruction of justice. And what he's saying here is that the special counsel did not reach a traditional judgment on whether or not the president committed obstruction of justice.
In essence, what they're saying is that the special counsel punted because there is this Office of Legal Counsel opinion that the president can't be indicted. So the special counsel did not even engage in the sort of analysis that it ordinarily would do. Now, they do summarize, though, the fact that the special counsel considered it. The special counsel did not draw a conclusion one way or the other. Instead, for each of the relevant actions investigated, the report sets out evidence on both sides of the question, leaves unresolved what the special counsel's view as to, quote, difficult issues of law and fact are. The special counsel stated that while this report does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. But then importantly, it goes on later in the next paragraph to say that the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, and I, meaning Attorney General Barr, have concluded that the evidence developed during the special counsel's investigation is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. Our determination was made without regard to and is not based on the constitutional considerations that surround the indictment and criminal prosecution of a sitting president. So we don't want to say that the two are at odds, but it seems that the special counsel's position was, it's not our position to decide this, but we'll tell you we're not implicating, we're not exonerating. Then Rod Rosenstein and Attorney General Barr together have determined that there is not enough evidence for the crime of obstruction of justice.
They're going much further. They're saying we have chosen not to prosecute this or go forward on this, not because of the Office of Legal Counsel guidance that a president can't be indicted, but based on the evidence they have.
And that's a win for the president. I mean, there's no question, particularly when you have Rosenstein in there, right? And because we've all been...
He appointed the special counsel.
Exactly, exactly. We've been talking so much about Rod Rosenstein. This is someone who's become, has been criticized at length by many on the right, who is now saying, along with Attorney General Barr, we do not think there is enough evidence here to move forward with obstruction of justice.
Let me go to our Chief White House correspondent, John Carl, there. So on the two big questions right there, Special Counsel Robert Mueller has concluded no conspiracy, no members of the Trump team conspired with the Russians despite offers, and the Attorney General has decided, along with the Deputy Attorney General, not enough evidence for obstruction of justice.
George, this will be taken at the White House and by the president's allies as a complete vindication of the president. As the president has said over and over and over again, there was no collusion, and he has said no obstruction. Now, Congress will continue to look at both of those questions, undoubtedly. There are further criminal cases involving the president and associates of the president. But in terms of what we are seeing here today, the special counsel, after 22 months of investigation, has concluded that the Russians certainly had an operation to interfere with the U.S. elections. He's proved that chapter and verse, but that there was nobody involved with the Trump campaign that had anything whatsoever to do with it. And as you said, although the special counsel did not make a determination either exonerating or finding the president guilty of obstruction, as far as Rod Rosenstein, a top vilified critic, vilified by many of the president's closest allies, he and the attorney general have concluded that even if you were to look at a sitting president as somebody who could be indicted, there simply is not the evidence to charge him with obstruction of justice. So again, bottom line, make it very clear, something the president has called a witch hunt for the better part of these past 22 months, has ultimately, in the view of this White House and the president's supporters, will now be seen as a vindication of the president.
Different view, Mary Bruce on Capitol Hill, our senior congressional correspondent. Mary Bruce, we're already getting some reaction from the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Gerald Nadler.
And, George, he is making very clear that he views this as the Justice Department essentially punting to Capitol Hill. In a tweet, Jerry Nadler, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, says that, quote, "It seems like the Department of Justice is putting matters squarely in Congress's court." He goes on to note and highlight that the Justice Department determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment. And, of course, he notes that the special counsel states that the report doesn't conclude that the president committed a crime, but it also does not exonerate him. George, you are going to continue to hear, I am sure of it, those calls from Democrats here, not only for the full report, but of course all of the underlying evidence, as they now have to make a determination about what the consequences of the special counsel's investigation really are.
Yeah, and I want to go to our senior national correspondent, Chairman Rand, for more on this as well. As Dan Abrams suggested, and we're hearing as we read the letter, seeing as we read the letter, there does seem to be some tension on the obstruction issue between the position of Robert Mueller and the decision and the conclusions of the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General.
Well, the way I'm reading this, and we're reading it in real time, is that essentially Mueller decided, it seems to me, that as the special counsel, he didn't have the position. He's not accountable enough to the president, to the people of the country, to make the mammoth decision about whether the president could be indicted. He punted to the Attorney General. He let the Attorney General make this decision. And then the Attorney General, with the previous acting Attorney General in this regard, Rod Rosenstein, said that even if you could indict a president, this case doesn't rise to obstruction. And here is why. In Washington, there's often the statement, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. What Barr says here is that there was no crime. He says, quoting the Mueller report, quote, "The evidence does not establish that the president was involved in an underlying crime related to Russian
that's the
interference."
Point I wanted to pick up on with Dan Abrams as well. So what he's basically saying is that because the president, there was no underlying crime, they didn't find any conspiracy by his campaign or by the president himself, that makes it much more difficult to reach the charge of obstruction.
Right. But I don't really agree with Terry that Mueller was punting to the Attorney General. I think that Mueller was punting. There's no question about it. But I think if you were to ask Mueller, were you basically saying, let's leave it in the hands of the Attorney General? My guess is he was saying, look, if impeachment is the sole remedy for a crime of a president, it's not our position. And my guess is that Mueller might take the position it's not the position of the Attorney General to make that sort of decision either. So that's unresolved as far as I'm concerned. Now, in particular, when you see the language in here, that the special counsel investigated this and that the special counsel did not draw a conclusion one way or the other as to the examined conduct, but for each of the relevant actions investigated, and the report sets out evidence on both sides of the question. That's what Congress is going to want. They're going to want to see what were the arguments that Mueller was laying out for and against. And I think Congress is going to want to make its own determination, because if the position is it's not our job as special counsel to make an indictment decision, then it's not the Attorney General's job either. Well, then it's the Congress's decision.
I wanted to pick up on that because we're going further. I want to bring in Pierre Thomas on this as we read through the letter and deeper into the letter, Pierre. This is from the Attorney General. In cataloging the president's actions, many of which took place in public view, so they're emphasizing that. The report identifies no actions that, in our judgment, constitute obstructive conducts, had a nexus to a pending or contemplated proceedings, and were done with corrupt intent, each of which would have been necessary, in our judgment.
That's right. That's the Deputy Attorney General and William Barr, the Attorney General, concluding that, look, based on the evidence that they saw, they could not conclude that the President of the United States obstructed justice. But, George, it goes back to the underlying issue that because they never could prove that anyone related to Trump or in the Trump campaign conspired with the Russians at all, that was the guiding point of their analysis on the obstruction of justice issue as well. And one of the things that's remarkable, as someone who's covered this for now 22 months, is that in each indictment, we never had a case where Mueller brought before court and accused any American, anyone associated with Trump, with directly conspiring with the Russians. And I was speaking with some sources about that, and one of the things that some sources said is that, look, we never could find that the Russians ever actually put anything in the hands of Trump campaign officials, even on the WikiLeaks issue. In terms of the whole question about people associated with the Trump campaign trying to get information with WikiLeaks. They never established that anything was actually placed in the hands of Trump campaign officials, George. And I think that was a key issue that at the end of the day, what Mueller did in public court was a precursor to what we see in this summary of conclusions today, George.
Mary Bruce, we're now hearing from the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the president's close friend, Lindsey Graham.
Yeah, and Lindsey Graham saying in a statement just now that this is a good day for the rule of law and a great day for President Trump and his team, highlighting no collusion and no obstruction. He says, quote, the cloud hanging over President Trump has been removed by this report. He goes on to say it was a bad day for those hoping the Mueller investigation would take down President Trump. He says it now is time to move on. And George, I think that is an argument that you are likely to hear echoed by Republicans up here, that Democrats were waiting for Mueller to wrap up his report. He has done that, and they are going to say that this should be the end of it, that it is time to move on. On the flip side, Democrats are going to argue this is just the beginning, George, that they need to see the full report and the underlying evidence as they continue to ramp up their scores of their own investigations into the president and this administration.
Okay, Mary Bruce, thanks very much. I know you're going to try to get some more congressional reaction as well. Cecilia Vega at the White House, one of the president's associates, tweeting as well.
Dan Scavino, his social media director, George, and I think it's probably what we'll be hearing from the president's allies over the course of the day and weeks to come. He says, quote, fact, as we've been saying for the past 2 years. And then he goes on to quote, the special counsel's investigation did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with Russia in its efforts to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election. That is going to be the key line from this report that the Republicans and the president, that his allies are certainly going to be championing for a long time to come. The president, as you know, is in Mar-a-Lago, Florida. He is expected to get on Air Force One very soon, within minutes, and head back here to the White House. So we may actually get to hear from him because he will be with the reporters who were traveling with him. He has shown uncharacteristic restraint in the last couple of days, George, not tweeting at all about this report coming out. And he's been described to us as by people who've been in touch with him over the last few days as being in a great mood. I can only imagine that this report is going to put him in an even better one.
Okay, Cecilia, Chris Christie, another ally of the president, former governor of New Jersey. Your reaction?
Well, listen, I think the money line in the report is that the special counsel didn't find the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with Russia. Not Bill Barr, not Rod Rosenstein, but Bob Mueller, who, I've been saying from the beginning, and lots of other people who've been involved in federal prosecution in this country have been saying from the very beginning, is the gold standard in this regard, a guy who should be taken seriously. He has found, not that he's found that there was no collusion, no conspiring between the Trump campaign and the Russians. That's a huge development for the president, because that's what he's been saying all along. Many of us who were involved in the campaign have been saying we saw no evidence of that right from the beginning. And Bob Mueller's now had everything at his disposal, and the Attorney General has confirmed that he was never once stopped from doing anything he wanted to do, from pursuing any avenue he wanted to pursue. And having done that for 22 months, that's what he found. And on the obstruction issue, George, I'd just say one other thing, that I agree with what Terry's saying on this, that in the end, this is not Bob Mueller's call to make. Bill Barr is the Attorney General of the United States. He is making that prosecutorial judgment. It doesn't preclude Congress from doing whatever it wants to do. But I think it is much harder for Congress to continue to be ultra aggressive on obstruction of a non-crime. And so that, I think, is going to be very difficult for Congress.
Well, it does.
And I think they're going to have to
I want to
move
follow
on.
up on that. It does appear that the Attorney General is basing his judgment on obstruction of justice in large part on the special counsel's conclusion that there was no underlying conspiracy or cooperation with the conspiracy.
That's absolutely right. And by the way, you know, the other thing that no one has determined here, and the Attorney General has said did not exist, was a corrupt intent. That's required as well. And the fact that there is no underlying crime, and the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, and I think that's really important as well. I think we now know why Rod Rosenstein stayed and didn't leave a couple of weeks ago as he was planning to do. I think Bill Barr wanted to make sure that he had Rod Rosenstein, who appointed Bob Mueller, there to help him make this judgment. And they made it together. And there's no way that Rod Rosenstein would allow his name to be put in this letter if Rod Rosenstein didn't support the conclusion that the Attorney General is making. So this letter is a complete home run for the President of the United States. And it should end any talk of Russia. There should be no further talk of Russia. Bob Mueller has said there is no evidence that concludes that there was conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government or Russian officials to interfere with the election. That should end the discussion of it. We should stop it right here.
Mary Bruce, we're seeing the ranking Republican on the House Judiciary Committee pick up on what Chris Christie was just saying.
Yeah, Doug Collins has just put out a statement saying that he hopes that Democrats and Chairman Nadler, the Democratic chairman of the committee, now has a chance to rethink his sprawling investigation. He says he hopes that Nadler recognizes that what may, quote, be political fodder for Democrats may not be good for our country. And I suspect, George, you are going to hear a lot of Republicans making this argument that the Democrats, should drop their investigations, which Republicans will argue are simply political and never ending, and that given that we now know some of Mueller's conclusions, that this should be the end of it. Democrats are going to, of course, fiercely disagree. You are likely to see them hone in on this one finding that we are learning today on the fact that Mueller says he is unwilling to fully exonerate the president. Democrats will, of course, want to know why that is. What else does Mueller know that they don't know already?
Dan Abrams.
Yeah, but the question, we have to separate this out into political and legal, right? I don't think there's any question that this letter is a political win for the president. You read through this letter, particularly the language from Barr and Rosenstein about obstruction of justice, big win, as Chris Christie points out, the Russia conspiracy aspect of this, a big win because you have Mueller also stating that. But when it comes to this language from the Attorney General saying that the Attorney General and Rod Rosenstein don't think that there was obstruction of justice, what is the impact of that? Meaning, what if it had been the reverse? If they had said, we do think there is, and therefore what? I mean, it still would rest in the hands of Congress. What the special counsel was saying is, we are not engaging in a traditional prosecutorial judgment. Why? Not because of the evidence, not because of what we found, but because the president can't be indicted. If you accept that, then you have to say, looking at the language from Barr and Rosenstein, that this is really just their opinion.
But that's why I want to get to. And I want to bring this to Terry Moran, too, because I'm going back to this idea of tension between Robert Mueller and the Attorney General there. Robert Mueller is saying the reason they didn't go further is because, in part, of this underlying judgment that the president can't be indicted for a crime while in office. Yet the Attorney General then and the Deputy Attorney General say they're reaching their conclusions irregardless of that finding.
Right, and their conclusion are based on two veteran prosecutors who know that you have to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, and if the president did not commit a crime, it's going to be difficult and operated within his constitutional authority in firing James Comey, for example, in public. It's going to be difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had a corrupt intent to obstruct justice. The tension there, Chris Christie, I think, is right. In quoting me, which is that I don't think someone in Robert Mueller's position, his Eagle Scout sense of his job, staying within the four corners of it, I'm not the guy, I believe he thought, to make this call. I certainly am going to abide from my perspective on that the Justice Department guidelines that a sitting president can't be indicted. But ultimately, the Attorney General is the constitutional officer there, and that is his call as well. I just think it's going to be difficult going forward to say, A, that there was collusion, or B, that you could win an obstruction case.
Mary Bruce, more reaction from Capitol Hill?
Yeah, Chairman Nadler now saying that Special Counsel Mueller clearly and explicitly is not exonerating the president, and he says we must hear from the Attorney General about his decision-making and see all the underlying evidence so that the American people can know the full facts. George, Democrats here have made very clear that they are going to use every tool at their disposal to get at this full report and the underlying evidence. That means using their subpoena power if necessary. It means bringing up the Attorney General to testify, bringing up Robert Mueller to testify, and some have suggested possibly even suing and going to court if they need to get to the bottom of all of this evidence. And George, I think it's important as we have this discussion about the difference between the political and the legal to also remind everyone of the different mandates here between what the special counsel was looking at and what Congress is investigating. The special counsel was mostly looking at the issue of criminal intent, while Congress has a much, much broader mandate looking into corruption, abuse of power, obstruction of justice. They have this huge sweeping mandate, and that is why they are continuing all of their investigations here while also saying that they need the full Mueller report and they want all of that evidence so that they can know what really the special counsel discovered.
Pierre Thomas.
George, the thing I'm struck is that, look, this is a complete vindication on the issue of whether there was conspiracy with the Russians for the president and his campaign. But Mueller does make pretty clear, based on this summary, that he had some issues with actions that the president took. And reading from the summary from Barr, it says, quote, "For each of the relevant actions investigated, the report sets out evidence on both sides of the question and leaves unresolved what the special counsel views as difficult issues of law and fact." So there is going to be a pretty intense debate, and I'm sure the Democrats are going to try to push on what was the specific evidence that gave Mueller pause about the actions of the President of the United States.
Yeah, they're going to push on that. But Chairman Wren, going back to Pierre's original point right there, one of the things we heard from the President, 200-something times over the last 22 months, no collusion, no collusion, no collusion. Robert Mueller is backing the President up on that.
And this is, therefore, a moment in our history, right? Since the President was elected, there has been a shadow over this presidency. Some people have looked for it to end because of their belief that somehow his election was illegitimate because of the involvement of Russia. Robert Mueller, one of the most respected prosecutors in America, exhaustively investigated with the power of subpoena and access to signals intelligence, human intelligence, all kinds of things, and he did not find evidence that Trump or members of his campaign conspired or coordinated with Russia. That is huge. It is something, frankly, that Americans should be happy about, that the president was not assisted by Russia. I doubt that's going to happen. But this is a conclusive determination, as quoted. This is not Barr's spin. This is Barr quoting directly Robert Mueller.
Let me bring in Congressman Eric Swalwell, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, for his reaction to that. You just heard Chairman Moran there, Congressman Swalwell. Special counsel found no evidence, did not conclude that there was any conspiracy to work with the Russians by the Trump team.
Well, I think it's a little early to understand whether there was some evidence that could not be proved beyond a reasonable doubt of conspiracy or coordination. Certainly the standard is what you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And that was not met. And that, I would agree, is good for the country.
Right.
That
and that is Special Counsel Robert Mueller's conclusion, not the Attorney General's.
Correct. So what we would like to see is the findings of Mueller and the grand jury material that existed, particularly from an intelligence committee standpoint, because we have an interest with the counterintelligence mission to understand if any individuals, including the president, did work with the Russians, perhaps in a way that couldn't be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, but a way that we'd want to know.
And then on the second question of obstruction of justice, the Republican leader in the House, Kevin McCarthy, has now said this is case closed. Your reaction?
Well, this is just the beginning, because the House Judiciary Committee will have a responsibility to look at that conduct. Now, I respect Attorney General Barr's ability to not pursue that conduct, but the House has a different responsibility, and we will want to see what conduct Special Counsel Mueller said had some of the tougher decisions that would have to be made. And so it's case closed criminally, but not case closed as far as did the president commit a high crime or misdemeanor.
So what is your next step?
To see the whole report. Every sentence, every word, every comma. Let the American people digest it as well. Thank Special Counsel Mueller for the years that he dedicated and the team who worked with him, but now the work moves to the Congress.
And just finally, do you accept, again, on that question of the special counsel's conclusion that there was no one in the Trump team engaged in a conspiracy despite multiple offers from the Russians, doesn't that vindicate or at least support the president's contention all along that there was no collusion?
I support the fact that the special counsel is saying he cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt conspiracy or collusion. What I would like to see is was there evidence that cannot be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest standard in the law, but that was still in existence, that people sought to work with the Russians? Because we all have seen some of the public evidence where they sought to work with the Russians that may not be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's still concerning if you're an American and you see your president, his team, his family seeking to draw themselves so close to the Russians.
Congressman Eric Swalwell, thanks very much. Let me go to John Karl.
Yeah, George, we've been briefed over the past several weeks, really since the Democrats took over the House of Representatives, about various committees' plans to move forward with investigations on a range of issues. Many of those investigations have really not even begun to get started. But on this question...
John, hold on a second, because we have Jay Sekulow, one of the president's attorneys, on the phone right now, and I want to get to him. Let me come back to you. Mr. Sekulow, thank you for joining us right now. Your reaction to the report.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you there, George. Sorry.
Jay, thank you for joining us. Just wanted to get your initial reaction to the letter from and the principal conclusions of Robert Mueller.
Very pleased. I think both, as we've said from the outset of this whole entire inquiry, that there was no collusion and there was no obstruction. And both the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, and the Special Counsel acknowledged there was no collusion, which, of course, was the basis upon which this entire inquiry started. No evidence of any collusion between the Trump campaign, the president, or anyone else in the Russian government or Russian agents. So that's number one. And on the obstruction, you can't be any clearer. There was no obstruction. And they said that is as crystal clear as it could be, and in fact made a legal conclusion based on their existing policies, absent the fact. This has nothing to do with the fact, George, that you can't indict a sitting president. They were very clear to point that out.
That was the point that they made. How do you respond to the quote from the special counsel that while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him?
Well, because their job in that context was to just lay out the facts, and they did. This was exactly what I anticipated, because you don't know until you see it, that they would lay out the facts and not draw a legal conclusion, leave it to the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel to make those conclusions. Because remember, unlike an independent counsel, this is a special counsel. They're governed by the prosecutorial guidelines and policies of the Department of Justice. So that merely falls into that precedent.
You just heard Congressman Eric Swalwell say that they want to see the complete report and the underlying evidence. The president himself told John Karl...
Unfortunately, I didn't hear the congressman because I was on.
Okay, then I'll just
take... But I take your word for it.
Okay, he said that. The president himself told John Karl last week that he wants the entire report out as well. The House of Representatives voted 420 to nothing to have the entire report out. Does the president still believe that the entire report should be released?
Well, I'm not going to. The president believes that it's the Attorney General's responsibility to determine what should be released and what is appropriate to release. I will say this. I don't think anybody, including the congressman, can complain about the speed in which the Attorney General and his team turned this report around. He received the report on Friday, and here we are Sunday at 4:10, and we're discussing what the special report that basically the Attorney General's office put together in a very short order. So with regard to the report, that's a decision under the regulations that the Attorney General of the United States will make. We respect his determination, and whatever that will be. That's not something that we would be involved in, especially as private counsel.
As you know, Mr. Sekulow, the president has the authority to order the Attorney General to do that. Are you saying he's not going to make that order?
No, I'm not opining on that at all, because we represent the president in his private capacity. Those are decisions that will be made by the Attorney General, and, of course, I'm sure the White House counsel would have the right to weigh in on what they deem to be appropriate.
And you feel this is a win?
A complete, not just a win. The entire basis upon which this inquiry was instituted was a concern over collusion between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. Bob Mueller and the Department of Justice could not be clearer. And you could not obstruct. This was important on the obstruction aspect. When you read the conclusions, to have the obstruction issue even as a viable one, which it was not, there'd have to be an underlying crime, which there wasn't. So when you look at this from a legal standpoint, it's very clear this is a complete win for the president. I think it's a win for the American people. They had a thorough investigation, and it's now concluded.
Jay Sekulow, thank you for your time right now. I'm going to go to Cecilia Vega at the White House. An official statement from the White House?
Yeah, George, just coming in from the press pool that's traveling with the president in Florida. This is from Sarah Sanders, and it says, quote, the special counsel did not find any collusion and did not find any obstruction. Attorney General Barr and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein further determined there was no obstruction. The findings of the Department of Justice are a total and complete exoneration of the President of the United States. Not surprised that that's the reaction coming in from the White House right now. This is a day that could very well shape the rest of Donald Trump's presidency here in this White House. This has been a cloud hanging over this administration for 22 months. Every single day, just about, we heard President Trump talk about witch hunt, no collusion. He said just as recently as Friday, no obstruction. This will probably have them, frankly, cheering here when they come back from Mar-a-Lago later today. And we also know, George, that this is something that is going to really shape the battle for 2020. This is going to be a huge point going forward. And the RNC is already weighing in, echoing what we just heard from the White House, saying no collusion. And they go on to quote a who's who of Democrats and all the comments that they've made about Robert Mueller over the last 2 years, everyone from Maxine Waters to Bernie Sanders. And they say they guaranteed us that Special Counsel Mueller would find proof of it, of no collusion. They were wrong.
Big day for President Trump, it appears. Cecilia Vega, thanks very much. Want to go to Tara Morantz for some final thoughts?
Well, it will no question be a main issue in the 2020 campaign, and it has cemented the trust that millions of Americans have for President Trump. He said for years there was no collusion, they're going to find anything, and in fact, that appears to be what after this investigation has happened. For the Democrats, they've got all these candidates out there who no longer want to fight the battle on Trump and Russia. They've got their own ideas. They're dreaming big policies that they have for the United States. They need to get that message to the voters. So there could be a tension between the eagerness of House Democrats to investigate the president and some of those campaigns which want to get positive ideas before the voters, where they might have a better chance now than attacking the president on his character or on his conduct on Russia.
And Mary Bruce, we're only getting initial indications so far from Democrats on Capitol Hill. We just heard from Congressman Swalwell, from the chairman of the House Judiciary, Gerald Nadler. For right now, full speed ahead.
Absolutely, even more so now. And we are hearing more even from Chairman Nadler of the House Judiciary Committee. He seems to be questioning the timing of all of this, tweeting that the special counsel worked for 22 months to determine the extent to which the president may have obstructed justice, and that the attorney general then just took 2 days to tell the American people those findings. And he goes on to say that the Justice Department owes the public more than just a brief synopsis. Democrats here are going to continue to hammer away on why they feel they need the full report, the underlying evidence, and they are likely going to bring up the Attorney General himself to testify. They could bring up Robert Mueller as they try to get to the bottom of this. We are also hearing from some of those Democratic candidates, many of them also out there on the campaign trail over the weekend, calling for this full report to be made public. Senator Cory Booker, one of the presidential contenders, saying that this needs to be, the full report needs to come out because, quote, an in-house, that they need more than just a, quote, in-house summary from a Trump administration official.
Mary Bruce, thanks very much. And John Carl, the president's been pretty quiet this weekend. That's not likely to last.
Not at all, George. The interesting thing will be listen for how his tone when speaking about Robert Mueller has changed. He has spent 22 months vilifying the special counsel, vilifying the investigation as a witch hunt by Robert Mueller and what he would sometimes call the 17 angry Democrats working with him. Now the White House is pointing to Robert Mueller and the special counsel as the paragons on this, as the ultimate word, and the ultimate word being, as far as the White House is concerned, one of vindication.
Dan Abrams, is this the last word?
Well, so if you view Robert Mueller as the final word, right, up to this point, everyone has said, well, let's wait for Mueller. Let's wait for Mueller. Here's where Congressman Swalwell understated what was found in the report. It says the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. It doesn't say we couldn't prove it. It doesn't say we couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. It says that they did not establish. That's big in terms of Robert Mueller being the final word. And yet, on the other hand, Jay Sekulow is overstating a bit what Robert Mueller is saying about obstruction of justice, because there the final word is really just coming in an opinion of Attorney General Barr and Rod Rosenstein in their evaluation of the evidence. That is not what Robert Mueller concluded. Robert Mueller did not reach a conclusion on that. And so when you view Robert Mueller as the final word on all of this, the answer is no question on collusion, coordination with the Russians. Big win for President Trump. On obstruction of justice, unclear.
Pierre Thomas, remarkable thing here. We're talking about Robert Mueller. We're seeing what he wrote right here. We never heard from the man in 22 months.
We did not, George. And I think it's really useful to go back to some reporting I did early on. And I remember a source telling me that at the end of the day, good or bad, that Robert Mueller would be the president's best friend if he found no evidence of collusion. Because the man is, his integrity is impeccable. He was known as probably one of the most unique figures in Washington, confirmed twice by the Senate to be FBI director, 100-0. In this town, that's virtually impossible. And they won't be able to say that he did not investigate thoroughly. If you look at the numbers, and it's the first time we're sharing them, 2,800 subpoenas. They interviewed more than 500 witnesses, and they made requests of 13 foreign governments for evidence, and they found no evidence of collusion.
That's the big headline there from Robert Mueller on the issue of obstruction of justice. He says he could not conclude that the president committed a crime, does not exonerate him, but the attorney general and his deputy going further, saying they believe that the president did not commit obstruction of justice. Those are the big conclusions from this report today. We're going to have our coverage continue right now on ABC News Live, our 24/7 streaming channel. Of course, a full report tonight on World News Tonight. I'm George Stephanopoulos in New York.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.